Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, as the murder rate in London overtook New York, something had to be done. And so yesterday morning, in the Sunday Telegraph, Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, wrote that she was going to release and launch today a serious violence strategy, including an offensive weapons bill. And we got a pretty good taste yesterday of what was to come today. But we also got, in that article, a justification for the reduction of police numbers, and Amber Rudd making it very clear that, in her view, rising crime had nothing to do with 20,000 fewer police officers than when the Tories came to power back in 2010. And this morning, ahead of her big press conference, she was out doing a round of interviews, and here was one of them.
It is not all about police numbers.
It may not all be about police numbers, but Home Office research leaked today suggests that it certainly does play a part. It says
I
it's
haven't
unlike
seen this document.
You haven't seen a document on this? You're launching a serious violent crime strategy today, and you haven't seen Home Office research into this very area?
Well, there are a lot of documents that go around the Home Office.
Not good, is it? I mean, it really isn't very good at all. She's the Home Secretary. She is absolutely certain, in her view, that a reduction of police numbers has not led to an increase in crime. And yet, within her own department, there is a document that says resources dedicated to serious violence have come under pressure and charge rates have dropped. And they go on to say that this may not be the main driver, reduced police numbers, behind the rising crime rate, but has likely contributed. So within the Home Office, you pays your money and takes your choice. You speak to the Home Secretary, who tells you that falling police numbers have naught to do with it. You speak to some of the officials who write documents, and they say it has. Well, let's hear a bit of Amber Rudd at her big press launch today.
In the early 2000s, when serious violent crimes were at their highest, police numbers were rising. In 2008, when knife crime was far greater than the lows we saw in 2013-14, police numbers were close to the highest we'd seen in decades.
Well, you can play that game in all sorts of ways, and there are lag times, of course. There are actions and there are consequences, perhaps. All I can say is there are 21,000 fewer police than there were in 2010, and take knife crime as an example, that's risen by 40%. So, what are the facts? What are the facts on police numbers? How do we compare with the rest of the Western world? Well, as I tell you, in England and Wales, there are now 120,000 police officers compared to 140,000 that there were back in 2010 when, guess who became the Home Secretary? Theresa May. She was the longest-serving Home Secretary for 150 years and presided over most of this fall in numbers. And if you compare us to the rest of the world, I mean, it's really, really interesting. Per 100,000 of population, Russia has more police officers than any other country. Well, I guess it would. It's a police state, really, isn't it? So let's take them out of the equation. Belgium, for example, Belgium and Spain have about 350 police officers per 100,000 of population. And believe it or not, the lowest of all the Western world countries, the country with the lowest number of police officers per population it's England and Wales, and we have about 200 police officers per 100,000 of population. Now, there are lots of theories about this, and I've seen one or two academic studies that perhaps back up the Home Secretary's view. Some say police on the streets doesn't make any difference. I have to say, that isn't the view that I take. I take a very different view. I think visible policing on the streets does make a difference. I think Rudy Giuliani, who was the mayor of New York 20 years ago, is a total hero for reducing crime rates in New York the way that he did. How did he do it? Street policing, clearing up litter, mending broken windows, stopping areas looking and feeling like they were in decay. And it made a huge difference. That's what I think. So tell me, what do you think? Do you think Amber Rudd is right to say that actually a fall in police numbers is not to blame for rising crime? Or do you think, as I do, that the rise in violent crime may well be down to fewer bobbies on the beat? And if you feel that way, call me on 0345 6060 973. If you think perhaps police on the streets makes no difference at all, well, it can't make no difference at all. But I mean, I'm talking in relative terms. If you take the view of Amber Rudd that reducing police doesn't really make much difference, text to 84850. Or maybe you think, actually, Amber Rudd does have a very powerful point. And she emphasised this heavily today. She said, in her view, the biggest reason for the rise in violent crime is the drugs trade in this country. And if you've got some comments on that, then please tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and watch us on Facebook. We're live here from the London studios, and comment there too. I'm going to go to Birmingham, to Owen, who is a new caller to this show. Good evening, Owen.
Good evening.
So, is Amber Rudd right, or are some of her own department right? You know, which way round is it with numbers of police and crime?
Well, the thing is, it's not. It can't just be down to the 21,000 police being cut, because we've also seen massive cuts in youth funding over the last few years, and the correlation is direct. I mean, you cut money away from youth services, it means that there aren't things for young people to do. There's not opportunities for young people, and then they're going out, roaming the streets and such like, and that's led to this tragic rise in violence, not just in London, but all over the place.
But if I was a youngster, Owen, if I was a mid-teenager growing up in Birmingham and I wanted to play football, I'd find it pretty easy, wouldn't I, to find a club to join?
Well, maybe you'd find it pretty easy to find a club to join, but I mean, it's not everyone wants to play football, things like that.
All right. Well, what if I wanted to say learn how to dance? I'd find dance classes in Birmingham, wouldn't I?
Well, maybe if you could afford it.
That's a fair point.
Austerity politics is just leaving people behind and making everything seem like you can only succeed in this country if you've got money already. That doesn't seem fair to me.
So, do you think, Owen, there is a slight sense of hopelessness creeping in to people who are poor and haven't got enough opportunities?
Definitely.
And that's what turns them to drugs and then to crime.
Well, I mean, not everyone, obviously. That's a
Sure.
massively sweeping statement, but I'm sure there is loads of people out there that will suffer from that will take that path. I mean, I've seen it happen myself, and I'm only 19, and I see the effects all the time.
Yeah,
people with nothing to do and.
Yeah, that is a perfectly fair point. I mean, I'm responding by saying, hey, there's loads of stuff in Birmingham kids can do, but you make the point that not all of it's for free, and I do understand that. I mean, what's your view as a 19-year-old, and I presume you go out some evenings in Birmingham or elsewhere? I mean, do you feel safer, Owen, if you see police on the streets?
Yeah, I do. I was mugged a couple of months ago, which was and because there was a rise in muggings in where I live in Birmingham, so they've put out more police patrols, things like that, and you do feel a lot safer.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to live in some kind of nanny state, but having police around when you know there's a rise in crime does help.
So the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, defending police cuts and saying they're nothing to do with the rise in crime, you don't quite buy that, do you?
Not at all.
Not at all. Owen, many thanks indeed for your call. And Owen talking about disaffected youth and not enough youth funding. That's his view. Andy says on Facebook, police cuts, lack of discipline, social media, negative music, lack of proper punishment, all to blame. It's a big old list, Andy, but you didn't mention drugs. Edwina said, kids need some sort of role model. Many do not have one. David says, of course police cuts have an effect on crime. These people are meant to be intelligent. You're talking about the Home Secretary, David. Surely you should show her a bit more respect than that. Richard says, obviously, if there's less coppers, there's more crime. And Trish says, every police officer in the UK should be armed. It's a slightly separate debate, Trish. Have to say, though, I reluctantly have now reached that point of view. Remember what happened on those London Bridge attacks. The police officer went, attacked those three murderous guys. He had with him a baton, which, I mean, very brave, wasn't he? Now, these guys are wielding machetes. He went at three of them with a baton. He got very badly stabbed in one of his eyes and injured elsewhere. Had he had a gun, he'd have finished them off there and then. So I've now reached that view too. But that's a bit off topic. Back to where we are. Is the Home Secretary right to say that falling police numbers have nothing to do with the rise in violent crime? I'm going to ask John in Chiswick that very question.
Good evening, Nigel.
Good evening.
I don't think simply by having extra numbers of police is going to solve this type of situation, simply because if we go back to, the sus laws they used to have, it's not the numbers of police you have, it's whether they're given the powers to do their job. And I feel that the police today are a little bit reluctant to approach certain groups of people, i.e. in London, black youths, because they'll feel like, because they're going to, get told that you're targeting black youths. I think wherever the problem lies, if it's Asians in Birmingham, the police should target them. If it's up north white gangs, then people should target the white gangs. If in London, for example, it's mainly black gangs or black youth, then I think the police have every right to target the specific people that are potentially causing those crimes. And it shouldn't be a racial thing, but I really feel the police are holding back, thinking, do we have the powers to do this?
John, you're right in many, many ways. Yeah, it isn't just about the numbers of police, it's about what they do. And that's absolutely right. There has been, in London, an 80% drop in the use of stop and search. And some of the figures suggesting that for every 10 suspects that are stopped and searched, 1 in 10 of them is carrying a knife. So surely, if the police were out there doing stop and search in a big way, they would take a lot of knives off the street. It isn't just about numbers, it is about what they do. And John, just to finish off, Cressida Dick, the boss of the Metropolitan Police, said many police officers are now scared to stop people and search them for fear of that taunt that you, John, in Chiswick brought out so beautifully, fear of being called racist. Funny, isn't it? The police seem to fear the criminals now a lot more than the criminals seem to fear the police. You're listening to The Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's now 7:15. As Home Secretary Amber Rudd tells us, a reduction of police numbers has got nothing to do with rising crime. Others within the Home Office take a different view, and I'm asking what you think. But first, the number of times I was asked in interviews, what about, Nigel, child refugees coming from Calais? Surely you're in favour of child refugees coming from Calais, because if you're not, you are a monster. You are a vile, awful human being. And I used to say, well, hold on a second. I mean, can we just make sure that we actually know who these people are? Well, have a think about this. In the year to June last year, there were 3,000 asylum applications received from unaccompanied children. Of those 3,000, the Home Office did checks on 705 of them, 618 of whom were found to be adults. Yes, some of them look like 35-year-old prop forwards with full stubble. It is remarkable. Now, that doesn't mean, that 65% of all those that came were over 18 or perhaps considerably, and one would guess that the sample that was done is where they were suspicious. But hey, clearly we are being taken for mugs, let alone the fact that one who came in the previous year, who was aged 18, or just under 18 when he came, did try to plant a bomb on the tube as well. So I would say this to everybody that likes to criticise me over this. Yes, we want to have compassion for genuine refugees, but it is the first duty of government to look after the interests of the people of this country, their safety, their security, and yes, their money too. Now, back to falling police numbers. Has that contributed to the rise in crime? And boy, a lot of very strong opinions. Phil says this is the tip of the iceberg. There's a generation of children growing up out there that have never known a police force. I think you might be onto something there, Phil. They do what they want, they fear no one. The country is lawless unless you drive a car. I'm a shopkeeper, and we are on our own with no support from the police. Larger companies can at least afford private security. Look to New York for how they do it, says Don Louis in Herne Hill. Don, I've already mentioned Rudy Giuliani. He's a great hero of mine. The way he dealt with street crime and street policing, and he fundamentally changed crime on the streets of New York. Perhaps we ought to get him over here. That's kind of what I think. I get this. I am an experienced serving armed police officer. We have a massive problem with our policing culture in the UK. We are trying to tackle 2018 violent crime with 1950s methods. Sounds good, doesn't work. We need tough, sidearm cops that will confront these thugs, not namby-pamby community bobbies, and that comes from Tony. George rather backs up the point I made before the break on Facebook and says, the problem is that criminals no longer fear the police. The police are far too busy being diverse and monitoring Facebook. Well, George, the other point I made yesterday is the Metropolitan Police are very proud of the fact that they've got 900 police officers dealing with hate crime. And I do know that sometimes things that are said about us can be very hurtful and very nasty. But I would have thought that rather than worrying about what was being said on Facebook and Twitter, what was happening on the streets of London mattered rather more. That's my view. Chris is calling from Shaftesbury in Dorset. Good evening, Chris.
Hi.
So, what do you think? Is it, is Amber Rudd right, or is she wrong?
Two things. Firstly, I agree with what you said and what George said. It's to do with the prioritisation of how the police is using our money.
Yes.
And that is to say they should be concentrating on protect and serve and not turning up at some journalist's house with 5 bloody squad cars.
It has happened, doesn't it? Yeah.
It does. So that sort of thing. The second thing is, I think there are parallels between what's going on in London and other cities now and the prohibition in the States. Actually, we should legalise and licence the production and sales of drugs, and that takes away any of the need of gangs to exist. And you saw what the violence was in the prohibition years of the States, and it all ended when you took away prohibition. I'm not a drug taker. I'm not one of those sort of people, but legalizing it and licensing it is what makes sense.
Chris, is it not possible that if drugs were taken away from the gangs as a means of making money and indeed being powerful, they might just find something else?
Oh, that is possible, but if you combine, that at least takes away one of the prime motives at the moment, but if you combine that with the police actually doing the job that most of us want them to do, as opposed to watching Facebook and that sort of thing for hate crime, I think that's a good start. I don't believe it's about just cuts. I believe it's about how the police force deploy the money that we spend on them.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely right. And your point about the decriminalisation / legalisation of drugs and their sale, and of course you could tax them as well, Chris, couldn't you? I mean, when did you come to that point of view?
Oh, many years ago. I'm a libertarian.
Right, OK, yeah, I mean, Nick Clegg is one public figure who does say this very openly. I've said, Chris, in the past, that I think if ever there was the need for a genuine Royal Commission, not just kick it into the long grass, but a genuine Royal Commission, I would really like to know an objective study of what has happened in Portugal, for example, who completely changed their drug laws 10 years ago. Has it made things better? Has it made things worse? I don't know the answers to that, Chris, and I'm not going to make my mind up on this until we get some really good evidence.
The evidence is in the late 20s and 30s of the United States.
Yeah, OK, no, the Al Capone era, I get that. Chris, powerful point, well made, thank you. Controversial point, but it is a very powerful point. Jeremy is a brand new caller to me, and he's living in Harrow. Good evening.
I'm not that new to you, Nigel. I haven't seen you for a while, though.
I recognise your voice now. Right, you're new to this show. Hello there.
New to the show. How are you, anyway?
I'm fine. I'm fine. I mean, I have to say, Jeremy, I just felt it was almost cringe-making this morning to listen to the Home Secretary. I mean, and here's her own department saying that what she's told the world is wrong. It was really, really, in terms of leadership, terrible.
It's appalling. I mean, Cressida Dick herself said it's not necessarily down to numbers or budget, and she's right. But there are several aspects. Now, I belong to something called London and Wembley Crime Prevention, and what we do, we are a crime prevention body. We're a registered charity, and we deal directly with gangs, and we deal with all of this sort of stuff.
Yep.
But it comes down to a lot. Firstly, there's the breakup of the family. A lot of kids now, their family is their gang, which is a real big problem. There is the drugs trade. We have schools that are completely toothless now because they're more frightened of being called a paedophile than actually because it can destroy your career than actually teaching. And of course, the level of teaching is lamentable with what teachers are expected to teach. But the other thing is we've got all these people going about knife crime and knife crime and knife crime. It's not the carrying of knives that's the problem. It's the will to use them. And I've spoken to several of our chief police officers, and they've said in no uncertain terms that they are not prepared to tackle the culture. And the reason for that is and I can tell you this, is they are more frightened of being called racist than the crime that's actually on the streets. It's an absolute disgrace. And I've always been, I will call things out as they are. You've known me from before, and I will say exactly what I feel. And I think there is an institutionalized cowardice where we have 900 officers sitting on their bums, drinking coffee, looking for hate crimes, going after soft targets who won't riot and who won't call them racist. And in all this, with all of this black on black crime and these terrible tragedies, this is happening, where is Black Lives Matter? Where are they?
I know. And Jeremy, we touched on this yesterday on my Sunday show. I mean, the fact is, when it comes to stop and search, what the police and the Home Secretary need to do is to say, far from this being the police force being racist, we will be protecting black lives because they are the vast majority of those that are being killed. Jeremy, one quick question for you as you're involved in this.
And one other observation as well, if I may make, before you give me the question. There are 31,000 serving officers. We're not talking about staff. That's 46,000 on the Mets. 31,000. That works out at approximately 900 police officers per borough. Where the bloody hell are they?
Well, that's the other question. Jeremy, I'm going to ask you a question. You're involved with crime prevention up there in the Wembley area. Can I just ask you, do you believe, from your experience of this, that having police physically on the streets helps to reduce crime or not?
Absolutely. The problem we have at the moment is that the police go in for reactive policing. They'll come after the event, assuming they actually turn up. The only time you see a police car on the street is either going to a crime or they're following you to check your number plate to see if they can fine you. We need proactive policing. We need police on the beat, and we need cars looking around there to put the fear of God into those so they know that to let the criminals look over their shoulders. Why should we, the public, do so?
Do you know what, Jeremy? I agree. It's about time the criminals became a bit more fearful of the police and not the other way round. Thank you for your call. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 7:30. Have the cuts in the numbers of police on the streets led to an increase in crime? The Home Secretary says no. Some in her department say probably yes. But before we do that, just some thoughts on America. Today is John Bolton's first day in the White House as National Security Advisor, and it's come at a time of sharply increasing tensions, a chemical weapons attack, as you may have seen in Syria over the weekend. This was Donald Trump a couple of hours ago.
If it's Russia, if it's Syria, if it's Iran, if it's all of them together, we'll figure it out, and we'll know the answers quite soon. So we're looking at that very, very strongly and very seriously.
Well, the one time that Trump, if you remember, did send a missile attack into Syria was following a previous use of chemical weapons. We will have to watch this space. And as you may know, I was travelling around America last week doing a series of debates at American universities. I started off in Colorado. I then worked my way across to Washington, D.C. I was debating against the former president of Mexico, Vicente Fox, on a number of issues. Is globalism the way forward? Is nation state the way forward? Immigration? How should states manage it? That kind of thing. It's all been put together in my latest podcast, Farage Against the Machine. While I was there, I interviewed Candace Owens, and she's part of a new movement called Turning Point, a student movement in American politics who are standing up and saying, actually, conservative voices should be heard too. In the latest episode, You'll find out why at my last event there were protesters outside. But it wasn't the students protesting. No. It was the professors who were protesting outside against me even being on their university campuses. Here's just a clip from it. I was hustled in through the back door because there were some protesters outside the front door. And I'm now shocked to find out that these are actually professors that lecture at this university. What do you have to say about that?
Do you know what the sign said that they were holding?
No to bigotry, and many other.
Right, it was like...
no to Nigel.
No to Nigel.
No to
bigotry
Nigel.
Is not up for debate.
So it's almost as if there are professors at this school of learning who don't think I should even be allowed to be here.
What people on that side of the debate will say is that when you bring a person like Nigel Farage to campus, or you bring a person like Jordan Peterson to campus, you are giving a platform to purveyors of hate speech. You are legitimating illegitimate views. You are pushing the Overton window too far to the right and basically bringing unacceptable ideas into acceptable mainstream discourse.
But 17.4 million people, in the greatest exercise in democracy ever seen in the United Kingdom, voted for the view that I'd propagated for 25 years. I mean, do these people think that the majority of Brits are hateful?
Probably, or at least duped.
Well, that was Brandon Van Dyke, who was happy to go on the record, assistant professor at Lafayette College, and there he was speaking out against his own colleagues, the professors who'd protested. The students, I have to say, that whatever their opinion of me, when they went into that room, they all behaved pretty well through all 4 debates. They listened. Did I change minds? I don't know. But that's not the point, is it? The point of democracy is you should be able to engage with opinions. And there's been way too much, both in this country and America, of speakers being no-platformed. The idea that these views are not acceptable on campus, I think, goes completely against the very idea of what a university education should be. Now, let's get back to policing and crime. And I would agree with those that say it isn't simply about numbers, it is about how those police are deployed. 900 of them working for the Metropolitan Police as we speak, sitting there, going through people's Facebook to see whether they've committed a hate crime. I'm not sure that's the best use of resources. And I have a new caller to the show, Oliver, and he's calling from New York, which we've been talking about. Hello, Oliver.
Good afternoon, Nigel. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you.
I'd just like to mention I spent my 20 years of my adult life living in London, then moved to Dubai in the Middle East for 3.5 years, and now live in New York.
Yep.
And now maybe my point of view is not a sophisticated argument. Certainly, maybe not for the intellectuals and the liberal elite. The Conservative Party used to be known as one of the party of law and order.
It did.
When was the last time?
That's rather disappeared, Oliver, I think.
Right. When was the last time you ever heard the word deterrence used?
Oh gosh, that sounds. But Oliver, you can't use words like that. I mean, that sounds all a bit harsh, doesn't it?
I'm only 40 years old, but you know, I'm a strong believer. You know, if you're in Dubai and maybe you consider, well, it'd be nice to have a few beers and drive my car home. I guarantee you, Nigel, you would think twice. Let alone if you were the predisposition to want to stab somebody, you will simply not do it because you will think that the punishment that will be meted out to you will simply not be worth it, let alone drugs in that part of the world. It's simply, they just don't exist.
Now, if I was, Oliver, do you live on Manhattan?
No, I work in Manhattan, but I live in Connecticut.
Okay, so when you're working in Manhattan and you go out for lunch, get a sandwich or whatever you do, do you see police on the streets in New York?
Everywhere.
Yes.
And not just that. I think actually more interestingly, I live out in the Connecticut countryside, in one of the most rarefied parts of the U.S. And even 8 o'clock in the morning, Sunday morning, yesterday, going out to get a coffee, you see police everywhere. I guarantee you, in tiny little villages, it is just it is a part of life, and yes, you feel more secure as a consequence.
And they do
yes,
take,
there's
Oliver,
less crime.
they do take a very much a no-nonsense attitude, don't they?
Yeah, of course they do, and I don't know what I haven't got enough experience to know what the relationship is between locals and individual police forces. But I tell you, whether it's as simple as speeding, drink driving, or going out to commit crime, you think again, and then you hear Sajid Javid and Amber Rudd, and they'll say, I want to be clear, there are complex reasons, and Cressida Dick talks about social media. I mean, for crying out loud, what are the war on drugs that your friend Nick Clegg likes to talk about, they're putting up straw men. The war on drugs has never happened. It's never existed. So, I know perfectly well, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners who live in London or other parts of the country are concerned, you can go and buy drugs in London very, very easily, and the police are simply not interested.
So your argument, Oliver, on drugs, and this is an argument that Peter Hitchens makes in the Mail on Sunday repeatedly. Your argument, I mean, most people say, and for example, on Facebook, Ev says the war on drugs is a massive failure that has cost billions. There is a perception, Oliver, that we've lost the war on drugs. We seem to lose it every single year, actually. You and Hitchens are saying we've never really fought it.
Yeah, it's called a straw man, isn't it?
Okay.
You've won the argument because it never happened in the first place.
Okay.
And, if there was proper deterrence, whether it's for drugs or other nefarious activity, and more police on the streets, I guarantee you would see a drop in crime.
And stop and search, Oliver?
There should be a lot more of it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed for your call. Loads of messages coming in on this one. Peter says it doesn't matter how many police you've got. It's the PC brigade that won't let them be police. It's a waste of time. Craig says, oh, come on. Of course the police cutbacks have added to the current trend. However, not the only cause. Youth club cuts and cutbacks to mental health contribute. Lynn says, take the 800 officers searching the internet for so-called hate crime and put them on the beat to save lives. And Tiago says, I can answer your question on prohibition in Portugal. I'm Portuguese and it got better. Well, that's one opinion. I would like to find out a few more opinions about what happened in Portugal when they decriminalised drugs across the board. Steve is a brand new caller from Sunderland. Good evening, Steve.
Hello there, Nigel. Nice to hear from you.
So, how impressed were you by the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary, over the last 48 hours?
Impressed? Really? No. Nigel, she's a waste of space.
Right. That's very tough talk.
Let's be honest about it. I mean, there's a lot of things that she's promised that's going to happen over the last few years, and they've never materialised. Of course, the police numbers have been a major part of what's gone on. But we've also got the one thing that only a few people have touched on so far, and that's the cultural issue. Now, some years ago, down in your neck of the woods, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
I used to work for a local force.
Okay.
Now, during that time, just after the Gulf War, and we had a lot of people arriving from faraway lands, and all put in different areas, deliberately to keep them out of the way of each other. But they found out where each other were. So we then had a big spike in knife crime. Now, at the time, there was a bit of a panic. Now, the Home Secretary at that time then turned around and said, we can't let the public know about these figures. That was the impression we certainly got in the control room where we were. We're not allowed to let the public know what those figures are and how much.
Are you saying, Steve, that we effectively imported a gang culture?
I think we certainly have in a lot of cases.
Okay.
We certainly. Thing is, when people came across the border, and this is the thing I think a lot of politicians don't understand, is they seem to think that once they cross that border and that threshold, they're going to become upright, upstanding citizens. What they don't seem to realise is they bring a lot of the wars and all the problems with them from their own homelands, along with them and their baggage. So the next thing that happens is they end up meeting up with a tribe or a sect that they've had a problem with, and we start the whole process again.
And so, Steve, how do you police a problem like that? I mean, let's say there's one community who completely can't stand the other community. How do you deal with that from a policing perspective?
That's the awkward thing about it. I mean, that means that you've got to have more people on the beat.
Yes.
It's that simple.
And would you advocate more police on the beat?
I would, on the basis that we've made so many draconian cuts into our budgets on a lot of subjects. Now, it's all very well saying, oh, well, we need this, we need that, we need more money for this, we need more money for that. And I understand that everybody's got needs. Christ, I live in the northeast of England, probably one of the most deprived areas in the entire country.
Yeah.
And we are desperate for funding. But will we get it? No. But what we do is we're trying to make the most of what funding
we've got. Yeah, and it's not always about money, it's about how you use it. It's not always about police numbers, it's about how you deploy them. Steve, I thank you very much indeed for the frankness of your call. So you listened to a clip of that podcast a bit earlier on. Go to lbc.co.uk where you can find out how to subscribe to Farage Against the Machine. There are regular updates and it'll tell you whether you've got Apple or Android exactly how to do it. Please have a listen. Whatever your political perspective, you'll find what I found out in American universities genuinely interesting. At least I hope so. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show exclusively on LBC. It's now 7:46. Do we need more police on the beat? Or do we need the ones we've got to act more effectively? Before I get back to that, the elections took place yesterday in Hungary, and they have been an absolutely resounding success for Prime Minister Viktor Orban. He wins his third straight term in power. There are 199 seats in the Hungarian parliament. Viktor Orban's party has won 133 of them. So, as you can see, a massive majority. And, of course, he's done it very much on a reduce immigration manifesto. Oh, and don't let Mr. Juncker tell us what we can or can't do. We're not going to have that. Although we will keep taking your money, though. We quite like some of that. Interestingly, once again, the trend, and we've seen it all across Europe, the Socialist Party have got 20 seats. They've disappeared virtually. We've seen the same in Germany. We've seen the same in France. Traditional socialist parties are shrinking and disappearing across much of Europe. And the ultra-nationalist Jobbik Party, well, they're projected to win 26 seats. So there is a big, I suppose you'd say, rightwards move as a result of these elections in Hungary. It used to be said that I was the European Union's biggest nightmare, campaigning for Britain to leave. I think Viktor Orban is going to be an even bigger nightmare because he doesn't even intend to leave. He intends to be there to keep saying no and to cause absolute chaos. Back to policing. How are we doing? How's Amber Rudd doing, for that matter? Because I thought it all looked a bit embarrassing this morning when she was contradicted by people and a report in her own department. Roger is a new caller from Windsor. Good evening, Roger.
Good evening, Nigel. Well, look, firstly, may I just say thank you so much for all you've done to achieve Brexit and restore sovereignty and democracy when it eventually gets here.
Well, I'm going to say it's taking a bit of time, but I think we are going in the right direction. Now, what about policing, Roger?
Well, what I was saying was, I remember, 30, 40 years ago, and I used to have businesses in Maidenhead, and I have a very strong sense that there is a disconnect between policing and police forces and the community, and that needs to be restored. In the 70s, you'd have a Bobby walking down the street who'd stop and chat to people. They'd hear what was going on. People would give them tip-offs. They'd warn people to look out for such and such, and they were part of the community. You had police houses which were in villages and in communities, so they actually lived within the community and were part of it, known and seen to be part of it. But then suddenly that changed. They were put into cars. They were told they had to patrol in pairs. So in pairs, they no longer talk to people. And of course, as soon as if you take 1,000 police officers and make them patrol in pairs, they're only doing the job of 500 police officers before.
Yeah. No, Roger, I get that. But in defence, and it was David Blunkett, I think, that brought this reform in, we do now have community police officers, don't we?
Yes, we do, but they don't have powers. And again, they tend to go around in pairs.
Yeah.
If you actually look at it. But I think the biggest thing is, I think that there is a disconnect between the police and the community, and it's becoming more of a police force than a service. It's almost them and us in some respects. They're more divorced from people. I think that's a big part of the problem. There is something else which, again, I haven't heard talked about, and I don't know a vast amount about, but I know that there was a study done in the States recently, which was on the school shootings.
Yep.
And the vast majority of school shooters have been diagnosed with attention deficit syndrome of some form or another, and were on prescription drugs. And that's been, studied and surveyed. And I do wonder if this is something we ought to be looking at in this country in terms of the increase of violence. I don't know. But I think it's a question
Actually, Roger, the linkages with mental health issues and crime are absolutely huge. Absolutely huge. But, hey, that's a bit broader than the debate I can have right now. Roger, I understand what you mean about that link between police and their communities having broken down. Is it too late to attempt to re-establish it?
No, I don't think it is at all. I think it just needs a change in attitude at the senior levels, probably in the Home Office to start with, but then down at Chief Constable level and below.
Yeah.
And I think you need to have, where you have police authorities, and our local one would be the Thames Valley Police Authority.
Yeah.
The elected councillors who make up that body need to take more interest and be more aware of getting the police more involved back with the community.
OK, no. Roger, you make a very good point. Police, community, is there a disconnect? Serving Met officer says to me via text, it is a disgrace that politicians and members of the public who have never been in the front line have the audacity to say that the officers are scared of using stop and search. Well, hang on a second, serving police officer. Actually, Cressida Dick, your boss, pretty much admitted that the other day. This is simply not true. Our current demands vastly outstrip our resources, so we rarely get time to be proactive. Well, sounds to me like some pretty major management changes are needed. On Twitter, the answer is increase the prison sentences for prolific and serious crime, up the knife crime sentence to minimum 10 years and watch the crime numbers drop. I get on Twitter. They're the deterrents I think that Oliver from New York was talking about. I'm going to go to Luke in Orpington. Good evening, Luke.
Good evening again, Nigel. Yes, Luke from Orpington.
So tell me, if I was to walk down Orpington High Street right now, and there'd be a few gangs of youths hanging about, and I know the High Street, how many police would I see, Luke?
You would see none. In fact, probably each week, perhaps, if I'm lucky, I might see one police car. You never see them. You don't see them in Bromley, you don't see them in Orpington, and yet there's never any knife crime. Well, not that I ever hear of. So I'm just wondering what the correlation is, and perhaps it comes down to maybe education, parenting, schooling, being engaged with perhaps church groups and things. As I say, you go into police, into London, there's lots of police. But as you probably well know, living in the region as well, sort of Orpington, Sevenoaks is, we don't see any police, do we?
No, I do live just down the road from you. And no, we don't see many police, that is true. Although, the argument would be that it's not especially an area of violent crime.
But why is that? That's my point, you see. It's not the...
It's more affluent. I think, between Orpington and Sevenoaks, there's a much more affluent part of the country. Yeah. And there is a huge link between poverty and, I have to say as well, a lack of opportunity and crime. Of that, there's no question.
I used to live in Westerham, and actually my father used to be a pastor down there, and there used to be lots of youth down there, and there used to be the Biggin Hill loss as well. And sometimes they used to clash. So my parents actually took them in every Sunday evening. We used to get together and, they'd have a Bible study and things. And it would be about 65 of them coming to our house. And it really gave them something to do. You give them something to do, and gradually they find a purpose in life and get on with it.
A couple of callers and texters, Luke, tonight have said that the sort of lack of investment in youth clubs, that kind of thing, is part of the reason. Do you believe that to be the case?
I do. My foundation was definitely get involved with church, get involved with youth, boys groups, clubs, all of that sort of thing. Give people something to do, give people a bit of a sort of a backbone, and give people sort of a direction and a hope for the future.
Luke, you made your point very well. Thank you. I've quickly got time for Glenn in Milton Keynes. Glenn, hello.
Nigel, how are you doing, mate? All right?
Fine. Far away.
Nigel, I work up in London, even though I come from North West London, where I grew up.
Yep.
They closed 2 local police stations. Nigel, I go for breakfast in the morning and I'm stopped by drug gangs who want to sell me drugs, prostitutes who want sex with me, and drug dealers, drug addicts. They're saying there's no police. If there was police about when there was years ago, You would get none of that around here.
And this, Glenn, happens in London itself, yeah?
Northwest London, where I come from. I grew up there.
Yeah.
You know, there was always trouble around there, but not to the extent. There's, you know, at 7 o'clock in the morning, they're walking around, all these drug addicts.
And is that every day, Glenn?
It's really every day I go to the cafe. Don't tell my wife that, she go mad. But I
Good old fry up, Glenn. Glenn, great call, fascinating. Glenn saying this in part of Northwest London he goes to, there is crime openly there, and he never sees a cop. Surely more police on the streets makes sense, doesn't it? I think so. Anyway, you've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm back tomorrow night at 7. Coming up at 10 tonight, it's Ian Collins, but up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you.